we're looking at throughout the world. There's neat ones, of course, like the prairie dog, which makes these neat openings, one above the other, so that the top one has a higher negative pressure than the lower one. So it draws air through, so it doesn't suffocate the poor prairie dog under the ground. The termite does the same thing, but they don't get credit because they're just invertebrates. Uh, uh, it's a fairly common feature for a great deal of life to engineer themselves into flow, except we don't allow that here. Literally, the water that comes out of our sewer system every single day. If you listen to those people down on Governor's Island, Malinowski and that crowd, you know, those billion oyster people, if you had a billion oysters, each one of those oysters would filter something like a gallon a minute. In other words, a billion oysters would be enough to filter the full 1.2 billion gallons of wastewater we dump into the harbor every day. So is that a solution? You bet your life it's a solution. The water used to be entirely filtered by the biota because she was ecologically engineered into flow. So I'm gonna take a look, because City Island was like this, and I wouldn't have paid any attention to it, but Sally said, Paul, why don't you design something at the right scale that makes a difference for a change? So I decided I would try and do that. And just, I'm going to take a look at City Island scale. Don't look at the creature herself, although that's a critical place to look, but see what the aggregate is of flow and basically the way the world works of organisms in that flow. So let me see if I can get first off, I'll get my presentation up, then go to the beginning of it. Always a good idea. Okay, I've done that. Now I will maybe get in the right format. Finally, if I can, I don't know how to do this. Let me do this first, the other way. Now, I'll find myself. Where are we? For the Zoom screen, I'll be with you. There we go. Okay, now let me share the screen if I can. And there we go. Drop the mouse, but let me. It's the wrong one. Now, why is that one there? Let's close that one. There we go. All right. So the problem before us is we build cities, and they're beautiful things, except they're absolutely like us. Not absolutely. We have the work of Olmsted. We have these beautiful parks in the city, actually in our part of the city, the Bronx, which should be the most park-filled urban center on the planet if it was a city by itself. But we have 34 square miles of roof space. We have 6,300 miles of roadway. We've got 520 linear miles of shoreline. And if we have 34 square miles of roof space, we probably have 34 square miles, I'm sorry, maybe 3,000 square miles of wall space. And all of it's dead. Basically, it's not like the Appalachians. It's not filled with life. It's basically the opposite. It's basically sterile. Silica dioxide, steel, macadam. And that's what causes the problem, except we can do other. And so you can see on the top, this is a colleague of mine, Bob Lanowitz, and you can see here that basically you have plants which do the only work there is in the biosphere, catching sunlight and carbon with it and turning it into the rest of the ecological system. And the difference between this system here and any economy is that this one on top is actually based on carbon capture, but that could happen again. So Central Park, on a sunny day like today, after a rainstorm, while there's urban heat island around it, Central Park will always run below ambient temperature on the shade when trees have water, because that's what they do with the physics of their surroundings. So Eric Sanderson's beautiful work, you can see here that basically on the right side is what we've built. On the left side, of course, is what was here when Henry Hudson came this way. And if it's 300 square miles of green space, About a fifth of that, 70 square miles, would have been marsh. And I believe Eric talked about some of that last time. Uh, but the point is that if you took that 300 square miles of landscape covered by plants as it is, the urban healing on the right could never happen on the left. But let me say it another way. The vegetation covering the 300 square miles is about 12 times the peak electric load of New York City. It dwarfs the amount of energy we use because there's a kind of explosion that comes when water evaporates and takes with it 580 calories per gram. So literally about 200 square feet of land, of roof space, vegetation cover, or something like Central Park, produces a ton of air conditioning every single day. And basically that's how carbon is captured. Literally, with the exchange of water, it takes at least 24 grams of water, 24 pounds, 24 units of water to capture a unit of carbon. But basically that is what runs the entire biosphere. And we've eliminated it from the city, but as we've done that, we've also eliminated the capacity to cool. And if you look around those two edges, the tide is a miserable 5.5 feet there, 5.2 feet, unlike our 8.2 feet up here. But that's still enough to actually run dynamic exchange. And that would have been entirely surrounded by wetlands and rocky archipelagos when Henry Hudson came a few centuries back. So this is worth looking at because if you build a reef, the cost is negative. It basically cleans the water and produces a fishery and turns all the nutrients and pollutants literally into the life that sustains everything else. So we were able to, it took us a while, but basically we were able to get rid of, I think, virtually all the oyster reefs. Barbara and I were talking about this the other day. It's something like end of the 19th century or into the 1920s. By then they were gone. So basically what once was the richest temperate estuary for oysters was eliminated because this became an industrial city. And it was not an easy thing to eliminate them, but we did. But just the point is here, a reef, if we were to build a reef tomorrow, next week, over the next set of months in Eastchester Bay or around City Island, over time it would develop into a pretty typical, productive and diverse oyster reef altogether. And this is some calculation from a while back from a group out of the Carolinas, but North Carolina and some of the other southern estuary states. Something like 38 to 50 kilograms fish per square meter. That's every 20 to 30 years. So what is that really? Well, it's about 8 pounds of fish every square foot. Or if you put it in acre terms, about 170 tons of fish per acre of reef, 6 tons of fish per year from a single acre of reef. So in other words, the fishery comes back because natural systems are structured so that materials are not wasted. So everything in the top picture goes back through the other components. And that happens in nature all the time. And basically reefs, the suspension feeding gills, so basically the mussels, the oysters, the clams, pull out enormous amounts, almost all of it, in estuaries. And this is what they have done for a long time. So this is the center of oysters on planet Earth in the 1800s. And basically there's virtually no oyster recruitment here now. New York City waterways, the densities are low. They're everywhere. We haven't wiped them out. But you can go down to the end of your block and there's not, say, 80 oysters per square foot or even square meter. There's basically a few, maybe 100 or two over some acres or parts of an acre. So they're here, but they're here in extremely small numbers. So DEC has been worried about uncertified water as an attractive nuisance, but that hasn't existed here since 1927, maybe. So that's not an argument that actually it would ever stand up in court, but there is no court. There's basically simply these regulations. And in DEC's defense, there's not a single metric for building ecological systems. All they can do is keep us from killing one another. You cannot poison the system from the Clean Water Act. That's all they're not involved in ecological restoration. They say ecological conservation. That simply means you can't poison the ecosystem. You can't in any way improve it though either. So I did write in Bloomberg's 2008 plan, literally how to use suspension feeders to literally be part of the ecological systems. And DEP has been building these oyster reefs down in Jamaica Bay. It takes a while, but the scale is everything. It just has to be of a certain size. So billion oysters is right, because those billion oysters in the right place would filter the full wastewater dumped into New York City every single day. And we're DEC in the ecological restoration and water enhancement business. They would do such things, and they do it in other states, but not here. So they're functionally gone. Okay, this is a paper by these folks here. Basically, oysters are gone, but this is just a couple years' work, and Chesapeake down there, where they've got polluted waters too, but the oysters will come back quite well. So really in the range of 50 to several hundred oysters per square meter. So in the really tens per square foot. So enough oysters to filter thousands of gallons per square foot and literally to turn nutrients back into literally the functional estuary. So this is further south, I think. Is that right? So here we have, basically, this is down, I think, in Louisiana. They put $60 million and literally restored oyster reef and 21 linear miles of coastline. This is the right way to think. They, of course, are in the oyster business down there. We used to be in the oyster business here. We should have, as of right, capacity to do this, just as they do there. But this is the right scale. So, you know, the kind of bags and all that you're putting in, it's not a serious enterprise, because organisms always operate. Essentially, we need their populations to increase at significant levels, because they're not at all now. So a billion oysters is working on this, and Hudson Raritan Baykeeper, and a number of people trying to get this done. But it's not simply us. It's also, you need enough habitat and probably some happy accidents, because we don't know how to do this yet. The marshes we can build easily, and we're actually thinking now, Barbara got a court injunction against me for trespassing on a property years back, and now I have to restore a bunch of the marsh over there. But that's I'm happy to work on that. Really, this is what we had. Okay, this is 19th century oyster pile underneath the Manhattan Bridge, and the other one is sort of sad. Really, it's 1935. It seems like some number of oysters, but by then oystering was gone here. So those oysters were coming from Oyster Bay or the Chesapeake or someplace, but not here anymore, because we had succeeded in becoming the greatest port and one of the largest industrial centers on the planet. And that actually took all the oxygen out of the water and the pollutants. So it basically ended what was the kind of dominance of ecological engineers of the functioning of this landscape waterway. There's a principle, it doesn't come out of the study of oysters, but there's the people who started the Yale School of Forestry. It's Fritz Bormann and a bunch of colleagues at Dartmouth, but now at Yale. They have a concept which is called the principle of biotic control. And it means something very simple. You need enough organisms, a large enough mass of the creatures, literally a large enough number to literally do the filtration work. I was going to try and show you there's many of them online, but and we used to do this at the River Project. If you simply take a aquarium, and we could actually do it at on a population of mussels, such as the one in any place around City Island. You put essentially a piece of a cut tube over it, and you dump a bunch of gunk in there. Could be muck, could be yeast, could be, but they will clear the water in about hours to hours, an hour to about a couple of hours, and then fully clear. We used to do this at the River Project all the time. It was a great demonstration. You could take the relatively murky river water, You would stop the input, and then over a period of about an hour and a half, the water would become clear again. And I had an exhibit at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, did the same thing. But remember, the scale of the population of oysters, of mussels, of clams is a critical factor, because you need a square foot of them, again, filtering about 2,000 gallons a day. That will filter a tank in a relatively short period of time. So the opportunity for ecosystem development here is pretty large. And of course, the oyster project has been a great start on getting us going. So it's about a mile fetch from across Eastchester Bay. And you want to know that, because that's what drives the wind. It drives the wind literally from the westerly wind that essentially doesn't exactly pound our coast. It's only a mile, but a mile is a fair amount. And that leads to the fact that we have marsh here, but marsh requires water to be only moving at about 30 centimeters a second. Can't be all the time a meter per second. It's got to be slow enough so the marsh can establish itself. And then the marsh, of course, does regulate the flow. And it has some tricks, which you'll see in a minute or two. But the point is that they seem so spare, but even the mussels here, and they're filled. So these are something like, the ones I've counted have been up to about 160 mussels per square foot to 78 or so. So we have a whole survey of this area. So fair density. And the mussels actually do a great deal of work kind of holding things together. I'm showing you this because look at the sand. The sand means that there's nothing alive there, and that's basically not a carbon capture area. But there are opportunities, because the water moves across Eastchester Bay, and it's slowed down. So the reason this marsh is here is probably something to do with the fact that there's a pier here, so that basically the water is somewhat slowed down. And of course, as you get over to the Tier Street and around the bend, as you go in towards Ditmars, if that's right, you can see that there's basically less velocity and therefore more marsh. So the previous engineer that was doing this work was the oyster, because basically they would grow out in the bay, and any place where they would increase the level of the bottom, they would impact the energy of the water coming across the Eastchester Bay here. So you can see this is early in the season. The plants are just getting going over by Barbara's Marsh here, and you can kind of see something of the dynamics. So rock here, but this is much later, just a week or so ago. So the plants are basically structured so that the velocity of water is cut down. The muscles in between them tie them together with a very strong protein strand, and the marsh itself will grow out into the surrounding open sand, or it would even more so if basically if the sand was piled up, or if the velocity was lower and there were higher nutrients. So it's got a couple things working for it. One is basically, if you look carefully here at these mussels, that's where the densities are high. So those mussels are pulling in, again, something like 2,000 gallons of water per day per square foot. And that water is nutrient rich. Those nutrients are powering literally this growth. So the reason those marshes are so beautifully green, 15% nitrogen, about 2-3% phosphorus, is because they don't have access to the whole water column just by diffusion, but they do because the engineer in this picture, only visible more closely here, the rib mussel, is basically driving water from the water column above into the plant root system, and the plant roots are then putting it together. They have another engineer, and I have many pictures of her, but I don't have them here, and that's the fiddler crab. And they basically, in the higher marsh, that is to say, up here, and we've got them on City Island here as well. They basically, because oxygen limits plant growth, mainly this isn't a problem because oxygen moves through sand quite readily. So those roots would be well oxygenated there. when you get finer sediment up here, diffusion is limited, except that you have burrowing crabs, 20, 30 centimeters. They actually take oxygen into the root system. They increase the denitrification of nitrate. Why do you want that? Because nitrogen is the principal pollutant. If you look at the reason we get the F rating in this part of the world for our water quality, sometimes bacteria with the combined sewer, but not much if you look at, I've run wastewater treatment plants, so I'm not impressed with the quantities we get here. But the nitrogen is come from the billion plus gallons of wastewater dumped into the end of the East River every single day from the very high quality, basically highly efficient wastewater treatment plants we have. But it's still nitrogen. The nitrogen doesn't go. A really rather brilliant engineer, a woman at Stanford, she used to run her system. So she would add acetate and keep literally the discharge water for extra hour or so on the Stanford site and denitrify it. So the men in the DEP here they probably figured it out since, but that was a great thing. So she basically realized that you have to do some things to denitrify, but this marsh is basically doing that in the mud and with the work of the fiddler crab and the microbes right in the area below. So, and we can build more, and we're actually looking to do this right now over at that marsh, and I'll show you some pictures in a second. But first we want to know the metric here, everything we are doing in the state of New York because of the Part 360s. It's a very good state, really forward looking in many ways. And I was invited to Cuomo's talk with Al Gore, and he's trying to get on the right track. But we will get nowhere unless we do two things. One critical metric is how much carbon we capture for everything we build. So when you build docks here on City Island, you're told to keep the dock narrow because of some microbial productivity. Well, the marshes you just saw, these marshes here, have the highest productivity of any ecosystem in this part of the world. Something like 3 to 4 kilograms per square meter per year. So under the dock system, it's nothing compared to that. So what you want to do is essentially have more of something like this. And carbon and reefs basically are, the oysters are pulling particulates, stuff they eat and stuff they don't want, and they're basically just burying those, including a great deal of carbon. So they facilitate CO2 drawdown. So remember, everything we build, every regulation on the book, everything AOC decides she wants to do has got to have a carbon capture metric. Otherwise, she and we are guaranteeing sea level rise and climate change. That's simply the equation there is. Basically, as CO2 increases, so does the temperature of the planet. As CO2 decreases over time, so will the temperature of the planet. But the better piece here is even as CO2 decreases, it means that life, the biota, plants, and everybody who depends on them, including us, is basically increasing, and that's good. So here you have a mud flat. Not that we need to get rid of all of them, but they're actually producing carbon dioxide in huge amounts. In other words, there's something like your kidney or liver or metabolic capacity, they're burning carbon. But not true, not at all true, for the subtidal sand flat, or the marsh and oyster reef. They're actually pulling in something like a kilogram of carbon or more per square meter per year. So they're basically burying carbon. They are carbon sinks. And we could build those around the entire western edge of City Island and in degrees on the eastern edge, as there is behind the school right now. So this is the wrong way to think. So basically right now, the plan is to take Pelham Bay landfill, and at a carbon cost that we will never repay or recoup, basically to simply rebuild the breaking infrastructure around the landfill. So all the carbon of the mining of that rock, of the placement of that rock, all the barge work, everything else is simply increasing the rate of climate change, basically adding more carbon to the atmosphere by stepping out this reef system here. So this is a great idea. It's just that it's simply doing nothing like the original natural systems of our area. So this is what I designed.
Yeah.
What I designed with Columbia University back in the 90s in Lamont, Doherty, and basically it was a 30-acre marsh surrounding the Pelham Bay landfill using dredge material from the local marinas. So the idea was basically simply to take this notion with the best of partners and basically show DEC what it was like to actually adapt to climate change when they didn't quite believe in it or sea level rise. But they probably now do to a greater degree. And this is basically the kind of, we will not get quite this because our marshes are cut off by cold weather right at the surface, but pretty close. So here is the concept for the western edge of City Island. We simply take any kind of reef-like material. Oyster shells are great, and that will create literally a wave break. So behave just like this material here, these rocks are right now on Tier Street, and basically, these rocks. So basically we're looking to do the same, the identical kind of thing here. And we can do this, and we're planning right now, Mike and Barbara and I are looking to actually do this work. As you can see, it's a very simple piece. All you have is a high energy piece. The nice thing about that is that this will actually slow the water down, and that will actually make it possible for this marsh to grow and fill this lower energy space back here. High energy impact, low energy habitat, and therefore denitrification and the suspension feeders, the burrowing worms and copepods and the rest, they will all be here. So these go together. This is what this world was like from the time the glaciers retreated 18,000 years ago. We had a rocky archipelago breaking the energy, and behind it, the soft sediments deposited and things developed. So the missing ingredient at this moment in time is we have Part 360s. We have waste handling regulations in the state of New York that require everything to be thrown out. So basically you have to get rid of the material. So the good part is we're not poisoning one another. The bad part is basically we have 19,500 tons of waste concrete, brick, and glass every single day in New York. And if I was better with the software, I would have shown you how this mile length could be literally a reef made from the waste, brick, concrete, and glass, clean material. This is 1 day's worth in the city of New York. You wouldn't, I look like an artless engineer. You'd obviously make it into an archipelago. You'd make it so it had a kind of optimal scale for capturing carbon, for supporting the biota, for supporting blackfish, for the whole ecological system that was here before we got here. And when the Fordhams were building their empire in oysters. This is really rather simple to do. You saw how other states are on exactly this path. And we have in our hands, passing through this city, we're now actually imposing on ourselves guaranteed climate change at the maximal rate because we're putting carbon into dumping this in landfills upstate. We could make ecosystems with it here that would actually capture within a relatively few years, and we would become capable of capturing carbon as opposed to. So why we don't have something like an oyster farm like the one on the far left here, I'm sorry, a mussel farm or seaweed farm on City Island, I don't know. Maybe that's the next thing we ought to, so oyster reef is fine, but this is actually doable. It's done all around the planet. South China Sea and the Mediterranean in south of France and all over India. And basically that the same kind of, similar kind of carbon capture capacities are also, they also exist in, I didn't show here, but there's basically fuzzy rope, this kind of plastic rope material that oysters and, not oysters, mussels and seaweeds attached to. And this is actually what I use, and Kate, Kate Orff used this in the project she did around Governor's Island. And I saw many in China and worked with people in Portugal on the same kind of thing. So it's the way we need to go. This used to happen to shoes when you dumped them into the Chesapeake, but they don't. It does not anymore. So I'm hoping that there's it'd be nice to have state, basically the requirements of the state based on some kind of uh, data that's that's actually reflective of the way things work. There is no there. You don't, do this experiment, and walk down to the end of your sheet, throw your shoe in, and come back in the following year and see if you get something, and you won't. But you did in the Chesapeake, literally 100 years ago, and it. We've talked about ways to do this, but probably we don't have the recruitment or the survival now for oyster young. So this I'm simply showing because if you had about 10 or 20 feet of marsh of not even oysters, but mussels and spartina, as is behind on Tier Street and in a few pockets around City Island, you would filter water to about a 10-foot depth at about 100 yards out every single day. So that's literally from a relatively narrow 10-ish foot band. You could double that and of course double the filtration capacity. And so Sally has always told me I think too small, so I therefore tried to devise a 5-mile length reef, and here you can see it. I hope it's satisfying anyway. But now we're getting at exactly the kind of scale that the Fordhams work with, and something that would make a difference. So now you're really starting to match or exceed the total wastewater and nutrient overflow from the land side. So it basically becomes reincorporated in the striped bass, in the weakfish, in the blackfish, in the biota, literally, of our coastline. So ecological engineering is a simple thing to do because we don't have to do it. We simply have to build the parts so that the growth and development of natural systems starts to protect our coastline, and it will in pretty short order. But we need to build the first part, where there used to be around the entire city something like 45,000 acres of tidal marsh surrounded by oysters. Now there's none. And so there's no little hard substrate habitat left, and probably not enough larvae in the water column to basically get it started. We could change that if we brought in literally oyster barges. I should have showed a picture here because I have some of those oyster barges from oyster farmers. We could get enough recruitment, that is enough young larvae in the water column to make a difference. But we don't know how to do that yet. So Billion Oysters, great people, literally Pete Malinowski grew up with oysters, knows them well, but they are not, there's no density of oysters, anything like it was here in the last part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th, because they're not back yet, but we could change that. So I'll stop. If there's any questions, that's.
Sally? Oh.
Does anyone have any questions? I know I do. I'm curious about eelgrass. Could you tell us more about that, Paul? And how would one go about seeding eelgrass?
Well, there's a great program it's done by Plug. So basically, and I was actually working with a group out by the Shinnecock Inlet in the Great South Bay, and they were fighting a restaurant that wanted to essentially dig a deep trench so they could drive their boats in and out. Anyway, there was a bunch of eelgrass there, and I got some, and I planted it actually right over here. Is that right? No, no, about here. So it's a simple, you need water that's clear enough. So it used to be that literally this entire area around the landfill and all was absolutely filled with eelgrass, and the whole bay was full of brant and diving birds basically all winter because this was their diet. So a couple things happened. Now I'm trying to remember. I think it was a kind of uh, there was a parasite that actually got to them, and that wiped them out here in the 50s and 60s. So eelgrass was just gone. The brant now will eat the green algae, but I don't think it's as nutritious and doesn't have as much function. But that's a great idea, Sally. I think what we could do, because there are areas, so we had a restoration project in Jamaica Bay when I was working with DEP, and that was basically the place they were looking at was where the water spilled into Jamaica Bay from the Atlantic, so right at the mouth of it, because that was clear enough. And the big deal was that that was often low enough in nitrogen, because nitrogen is perfectly okay for the plants. It just, if you've ever seen eelgrass growing, a lot of times you'll see the outside covered with epiphytes, other algae and different kinds of animals. And that's basically because the water is too eutrophic and there's too much gunk in it, too many algae growing in it. That's a bit of a problem, but especially when water is not clear enough, because the uh, zoster has got to have, the eelgrass has got to have light. But I bet it would take here. And so the thing to do is see where, so Cornell has got a big, I'm trying to remember the guy's name. They got a big program for restoration. They probably have other ones too. You might know somebody out at Stony Brook there, Mike, too, but I'm not sure. I know Cornell has been heavily into this. We should probably do that. Get a bunch of plugs and you put them in with your foot or however you want. It's a shallow dive because they're like shallow water. And that would be valuable because I think the water, I think the water's clear enough now here for them. And it's a strange creature. Some parasites come about because the population is weak from other things, and the high nitrogen would be one. So I'll look back because I remember this was a ecological disaster people were trying to do something with years ago, but they couldn't. We might now. And so zoster is, so basically it's the one, it's actually, it's pollinated underwater. It's literally a flowering plant and it grows all over the planet, always in clear, shallow waters. It's basically fairly high velocity. So it grows in kind of a sandy, silty material. So it can take that pretty well. And just it's a critical habitat for things like weakfish and a bunch of the crabs and a bunch of the things like the burrowing soft shell clams and all hard shells. So yeah, it's the same problem in a way. We would need to get a population large enough to get going, but when you're starting with plugs, if they started taking off, they could potentially start producing seeds, and then we would be in a very good place indeed. And they grow by shoots as well. So I love the fact that you're forcing this oyster crowd into another. But that's a coupled system. So basically, the high velocity uptake is with the oysters themselves, and then kind of on the shore you have some of it's taken up by the terrestrial plant, literally, or intertidal plant, and then basically subtidal, it's a zoster, and that's a fairly miraculous plant. So tied in just almost like the oysters to many parts of the biota. A lot of fish and invertebrates live in that habitat, but gone now.
So if we plant some eelgrass, Paul, you think it's going to come back?
I think it would, because it looks to me like, I mean, the water's plenty clear. I haven't seen it this clear ever. The nitrogen is an issue, but I've seen it growing in another high nitrogen area. It's just a matter of how much. And if we can find the right subhabitat, like in the shallows, someplace where there's decent mixing with the Western Sound, or just it could well take off, because it's basically I'll think of what that organism was. It's something that I think could come back because the conditions are right. Basically, you just need to get it started. You certainly just need clear water, and we have that now. I haven't even seen Noctiluca. I mean, this is one of the lowest I have. There's almost nothing in the water column. I just don't. I get a few things at the plankton net, but not many.
So are we starting tomorrow?
He sounds good. Um,
Plant some at my house. That's good.
yeah, well, it's a matter of where to get it. So I'm not in touch with the folks at Cornell, but somebody maybe take a look and see. So they don't. It's not a plant they have at the. It's basically it's not a hassle, but takes some care to grow. And Cornell has greenhouses and all where they grow it, and they have sites I think out in the Hamptons. So yeah, but
Mm.
that would be a very 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 good thing to do because that would be another real contributor to the ecosystem here.
And that's not one that we can get out in Staten Island.
No,
Right.
no, they
No.
don't have that. But Cornell might.
We'll have to start a group called the City Island Eelgrass Restoration Project. Right?
Yeah, will they let us go? Saying we thought they were oysters. I don't know. They probably won't.
Yeah, right. We really wanted eelgrass. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's not going to work. Um, but that's a wonderful idea. I'll take a look because there's a very very strange. It's like it's a amoeba-like creature. Oh, geez, they're colonial.
I
Anyway.
mean, I was out in the Hamptons last weekend. You could have told me. I would have brought some back.
Yeah, well, that's what I did last time because I was working with some other groups and I literally collected it and just brought it. But it's there's you can also buy it, and that probably because it takes so long to do anything. If we just get some from somewhere and try it, that's worthwhile because we can also keep an eye on it, which is worth doing.
Road trip.
Yeah. No, that's right. No, and it's a shallow dive anyway. It's like a walk on the beach for you, Mike. Just it's a
Yeah.
a few feet of water. It's ideal.
Yeah. I'm game.
Oh yeah, no, let's do this. I'm glad you bring it up, Sally, because I love it. Just I mean, really, if you go to the backside of Fire Island, it's full of the wheatfish, because they love the eelgrass. It's just all the shrimp and everything in there, and that's where they go. It's a great place and beautiful. There's a lot of diving birds. Everybody.
Is that it?
Oh, well, let's go.
Okay. All right. Well, it's just that the light's falling now. We got to wait till anyway. That's all right. We can. But I'm with that. That is good indeed.
Just say the word. We're going.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, just let's also check if somebody can check and see what the Cornell folks are like, and I will see. I haven't been in touch with that program for quite a while, but I know they were. I know the guy very well. It's just I can't think of his name. Because they've
What's
been.
the Cornell extension around here? Is there one on Long Island?
Well, this was actually a group. There was the researchers as well, and they were a specific eelgrass restoration group because of the specialties of the plant, and because it's water. It's very interesting and from a biological perspective because it's literally it's got a flower that opens up in the water, and the pollen is distributed instead of being wind pollinated like our ragweed or something. It's water pollinated. So the water it's literally got to swing by the plant, and the pollen has to stick to the. So it's very interesting to for fluid dynamics types to look at this, and they did, but they also got good at growing it. But they were kind of shy at trying areas that may or may not work. And so I don't, being a follower of Darwin, I don't believe that. I think you just try it. They'll tell you if they don't like it, they'll pass on or move or something.
Yeah.
But we can right away just get that. I realized that. So Barbara and Mike were out there. I realized that basically we ought to get the plugs from the native plant nursery. But I've done many times. We will simply go with a sharp shovel and go to the marsh down on by Ditmars and cut sections out. They don't need to be big. I mean, they're really if you just cut it, and then you just make an opening. So this is you have instant marsh on that whole length. Whatever when those bags come, we'll just fill them up with sand. That's just doable and count it as done. So while we're standing there, Mike, we can talk about where we're going to go to get the eelgrass.
Right.
So if you ever sail over areas where you see it, Sally, it's all over in the sound, but I don't know anymore. When I used to fish more, I used to know better because that's what you look for.
You can just spend a lot of time on Google looking for eelgrass.
I had another question. You know, you talk a lot about the importance of, in terms of bringing back the oysters, that it has to be on a grander scale. How do you jumpstart the populations
Well,
if
this
it
is
has to
why.
be in such a grand scale?
No. This is what you do is I think you build multiple sites. This is why I want to start yesterday, and we have
Yeah.
literally. So Barbara has got she got a fake gun. She's going to go to a one of the coffee houses and just make sure they give her all their old coffee bags. So it's, you know, it wouldn't cost them anything. So it's a
The burlap sacks?
burlap
Yeah.
sacks. So we get the burlap sacks and we fill those with sand, and we put them. We make, so the marsh you just saw. We can even extend it. You basically make a much larger marsh, and you help that along by getting rocks, and even Mike's spectacular idea. We're going to, so yeah, you might lose the mushroom mooring for your boat, but you know, that's okay. You can get another one. So what we're going to do is drag
Lot
it out
of
of the
them.
water. The old ones don't have an eye, basically eye hole at the top, and use those as water breaks, basically to protect the marsh on the other side. The back side and sides of those, we can put oyster shell in and other kinds of oyster habitat. So there's a bunch of problems. One, and I was trying to get the ladies, Cody and relative, to go on this road. But
Alana? Yeah.
they're so basically one is working on, is looking at literally predation, and the other one is on substrate. And there's a paper there, but they're not jumping at this. I'll talk to Pete Malinowski. He and I will do it maybe, because the two issues are, is there enough substrate? Well, there isn't. But how much is enough? We don't know. How many larvae are there in the water? You know, there's a bunch of things we don't know. And then there's predation. So Cody was interested in looking at that, documenting that with maybe a GoPro or something like this. So, but I of course want to know exactly how it works. But then the other piece that I want to know is basically, how can we get oysters started here so they start to take off? And so it would be of value for everybody's beach, yours including, Sally, if we basically increase the scale of the Spartina and rib mussel coverage, and then on the seaward side, on the bay side, actually created maybe all the way into the subtidal reef-like structures, maybe dragging out. The best thing would be to drag out those no longer usable mushrooms, because now you have a good sized structure that can stop waves, and now we can be certain that we can easily put other kinds of hard habitat around that, oyster shell and the rest. And then on the shore side, we can get the mussels, the marsh, and the fiddler crab together, because they'll come in as long as the marsh starts to grow. So the concept is, we will build enough marsh around City Island to make a difference. And then so Mike's idea is just absolutely perfect. But then I think the piece we really do need, I think I sent around at some point, I'm sorry, I was going to put it in here. Let's see if we can have an oyster festival here every summer, where we invite 1 or 2 or 3 oyster sales types to bring literally there's a cost here, of course. But they will have barges filled with breeding oysters. My feeling is, if we do that, you know, thousands to many thousands of oysters breeding, throwing out billions and billions of larvae on a daily basis, I think if we do that, we'll be kind of pushing the equation over, so that the recruitment, the number of larvae, and see, you don't need to. So Mike took me to this beautiful place up in New Rochelle, where there's literally a bunch of maybe 5-year-old oysters more sticking out of the mud, which they don't like much, but they're there. And then Mike has seen a bunch underwater. So we don't need to basically, and we also don't know enough to do everything everywhere. But we could basically, if you park that oyster barge off your street, Sally, and then Barbara parks one on her side, and we get somebody on the, I think we will get pockets of larvae settlement where the larvae will be so dense they will overpower the predation level, and we'll get oysters that will grow and develop into breeding population. So I don't know. And you, like 3 years from now, you can say, "Oh, Paul, you're such an idiot." You know, but you, it just the guess is we need more larvae, we need more substrate, and then we also need filtration capacity of the things that work with them. And that's why I want the mussels and the marsh in there. But nobody knows because the model I showed from my friend of mine who did his thesis work with Howard Odom, models seem to show that if we get enough of the parts in place, they'll start to take over. But where and when, but for certain we don't have the habitat, so let's build that. For certain we don't have the larvae, and because we're an oyster reef club, let's bring oysters over here so that people know what they are, because they have no idea. I mean, just and especially when the huge numbers, and that would be. It's just a way to start to celebrate what this island always was, and get people to the water as opposed to just going to the restaurants. Get people to understand that the water was run and could be run again by eelgrass, yes, but certainly by the marsh grass on the edge, by the oyster reef, and the humble rib mussel that nobody eats, luckily. The same filtration capacity. And you try it. They have this byssal strand that they tied the marsh together with. It's tough as anything, so that's what holds it against the hurricanes or anything. So we just need to increase that scale. Yeah, and so scale of all the parts. So but it's the right question, Sally, because it's just how do you do something that actually has to happen in whole cloth in a kind of piecemeal basis, knit by knit, so to speak. Ecology, damned if you do, but anyway, so it can be done.
We start with today.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's what you got to do. Yeah, we've thought about it, but this is so let's start, Mike. When you find maybe if you find one of those pieces, mushrooms, just haul it up and let's start playing with it, or a few of them right on Barbara's beach there. Because then we can do that. We can I think Cody's interested in looking at velocities as I am, but we could easily run educational programs. I mean, people could get master's degrees, and you could run whole courses around this stuff, and maybe we'll get Maritime in to join us. But it's just it wants to happen, and you need people. Your idea, I love it, Sally. Just that people say, well, we're not an eelgrass group. Well, but the fact is that there's trade between the eelgrass and the oyster reefs, and we're not against trade. We're not like some.
Right. So let's get those 3 by Barbara's house tomorrow.
Yeah. All right.
I didn't get my burlap sacks yet, but I'm working on it.
All right.
No, but
I'll call you in the morning.
I can get those 3 mushrooms out by your house tomorrow.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
good. Yeah,
Great.
let me know, because I'll help drag them over. Because it's just we can play with. Because then we have something. It just, and you need this at yours by you too, Sally. So look at where, and we can come down to and look. We want to build marsh, and we want to build it by literally, yes. So you can behave like the Army Corps, perfectly good people, build a dam, but we have this material that's actually there and doing essentially nothing. We could make it into a velocity gradient around which other velocity gradients made by life itself can be structured.
Yeah.
And that's not hard. So let's get down that road. That'll be
Okay, so you're on 8 o'clock tomorrow morning at my house.
Yeah.
Right.
What time? We know when the tide is? We don't know.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an early morning tide.
Yeah. No, then I'm not
So
ready for that.
so well.
Yeah.
So we'll get the equipment. We'll get set up, and we'll start on a.
Yeah.
We'll get them in by the afternoon.
Yeah. Good.
Okay. Okay. That I think where our time has run out. So,
All right.
but we are our homework. We know what our homework assignments are, right?
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah. Well, I love this idea, but let's also. So this is part of a year out, but let's get those barges. Could be at Belden Point, could be at the Morris Yard Club, could be right by it. So, but basically get them. So we have, people like to hate the tourists, but they're basically there's some 11-year-old there who's going to change the world if you let him see the way it can work. Yeah. And it can't be by sitting on your hands, as I'm not going to accuse people around here, but there are people who do. So it has to be, you have to try things so you don't get are worthy hypotheses that haven't been tried and haven't been done. I think the oyster barge is kind of perfect because the Fordham's had them. We can do
Yeah.
it again, and just matter of it. Just you got to work out the parts, and it could be a tourist attraction, could be a great thing for 175, but just all the people here, and also for the folks at Maritime know nothing about the way oysters really work. I mean, some of them are looking at some parts, but they could learn a great deal more, and it would just be valuable, just because we can make a difference here in a pretty short time. But we got to start, as you say, Mike, now. But take a look, Sally, and we'll come down and look at where a marsh might be. As Barbara pointed out, there's a 440 million year old taxa that's going to be looking for a place to lay her eggs come June. And so you got to make sure there's open space for her. But we can do that. That's not hard.
Okay.
They'll come.
Not hard.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. So
Okay.
we'll have our assignments,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, no, that's great. But so yes, I always get, when you ask me a question like this, ecological engineering, it always makes me anxious, Sally, because there's things I know, but then there's parts of it that I know I don't know. So yesterday I was just, I was talking about it before I had the parts in place. Was overwhelming. But anyway, I got more.
Well, you're as always very inspirational. You have
Yes.
such a creative vision, and nothing stops you. So it's
Yeah.
really great to hear.
Well, let's stand up to that. So let's get those mushrooms in there. They're wasting their
All right.
doing nothing
That's
out.
right.
That's
Okay. Who's emailing out the homework assignments?
right.
That's Barbara.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, this is
Okay,
excellent. All
guys.
right. Well, thank you. And so
That's
let's yes.
All right.
So I'll be down. We'll be down. So let me know. Maybe tomorrow. Let's get this done.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Oh,
Thank
you
you very much,
Yeah,
Paul.
Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Okay. This is great.
Okay.
Good night.